Lahore.
Alright, so here we are in front of the elephants.
It was a pretty sunset.
In our year-end episode. I began a tradition just last year that I've decided I've wanted to continue, and that is picking out some of the most interesting films I've discovered this year, loosely ranking them and talking about them all in this one episode. And yeah, this is it, the list for 2022. Now, for anyone who listened to last year's year-end episode, the Season 5 finale, you know these are not exclusively films that were released in 2022, but in fact just films I saw this year from any year of release that kind of stuck in my brain as a really unique, noteworthy movie. This year, I watched roughly 265 full-length feature films that I had not seen before, and man, what a journey 2022 has been in film. I caught up on a lot of classics that I just had never seen before, like Raging Bull, Total Recall, What's Eating Gilbert Grape, the original 1978 Halloween, Magic Mike, Modern Times, Eraserhead, High School Musical, All That Jazz, Full Metal Jacket, 16 Candles, Godfather Part 2, Black Narcissus, and Twilight's New Moon through Breaking Dawn Part 2. So, a lot of classic films of some recognition that have made an impact in cinema. And I just got through a lot of them, and I'm proud of that. But none of these are among the 20 films that I'll be highlighting today. Yes, I've picked 20 out of the 270-ish I've seen, and I'll just talk about them here. I recommend all of these movies, but they are, again, loosely ranked. So as I go on, my personal opinions of the films will continue to rise. I say loosely because many are interchangeable with a film that comes like 2 or 3 places before or after, so I just kind of told myself to rank them. Basically, I mean, for me, the metric is probably memorability and uniquity. Now, over my time as a huge lover of film, which spans roughly 4 years now, right around when Film And originally started, I was lucky enough to keep track of what I saw, and of the past 3 years, 2022 is in fact my laziest year of watching movies. Granted, lazy still means that I watched like 270 new movies this year, which for those of you counting at home, is over 5 new movies a week, every week. But in fact, in 2020, I watched more, a total of 288 films. Granted, lockdown helped with that number quite a bit, but even that only falls short to the cinematic year for me that was 2021, wherein I found the time to watch 320 brand new full-length feature films. Needless to say, I had time in 2021, a lot of time, but that's even nothing, because my record of 320, that is very much shadowed by my friend Connor, the host of Film and To Watch to Read, who spent that year I believe, watching 400 films. 400. That is 7.5 new films a week, more than one every day. It's a crazy feat to accomplish. And granted, I watched like 428 total last year, but I'm not counting short films, of which I watched, I guess, 108, but that's neither here nor there. What I'm saying is, I'm crazy, and Connor's even crazier, and comment on his review of 2019's Cats if you want him to finally write his long-awaited self-help book, I watched 400 movies in 1 year, and this is what I learned. So, to kick off this exciting episode, Cat People. Now, this is not the original Cat People, but the 1982 remake from writer-director Paul Schrader, whose biggest credits include 4 of Martin Scorsese's films, being the writer of Bringing Out the Dead, Temptation of Christ, Raging Bull, and Taxi Driver. most recently making waves in the film and verse with his new film, The Cold Counter, which, if you listen to this year's Andes, you know me and Connor adore. Now, Paul Schrader's fourth film, Cat People, is a retelling of the classic 42 film, but this time around can actually sort of make good on the promise of seeing cat people. The original does a great job with its limited resources to create like fun, crazy visual tricks, but the Paul Schrader version just has more visceral scenes, more action-packed scenes, more character development, and more sex, which you might have thought was a big part of the first one, and it like kind of is, but dang, this thing is a very specific flavor of sexy, and it's quite a trip. I wasn't like fully into it, but I gotta give this movie props just for execution. Plus, there's interesting performances from Malcolm McDowell and the titular cat person, Natasha Kinski, who is the daughter of famed German actor Klaus Kinski. Moving on, we've got 19 left, and I'm gonna try and go as quick as I can. I can't really dawdle on the early ones too much, or we will be here all night. So yeah, next up, Mio in the Land of Fallaway. 1987's Mio in the Land of Fallaway is a weird movie, a weird movie, and it makes the list because it is the feature film debut from Christian Bale. Yes, he plays Mio's trusty sidekick Yum Yum in the Land of Fallaway as he works to defeat the evil king and rescue a fantasy world where he is prince and his parents are super loving and not depressed like in the real world.
I'm frightened, Yum Yum. Why me? Only a male child of royal blood can fight the evil knight. Only a king's son.
Directed by Nikolai Gramatikov, this is a co-production on Sweden, Norway, and the Soviet Union, making it not only one of the final Soviet films before the fall in '89, but a very unique example of modern Scandinavian folktale. The children's narrative in '80s practical/digital effects screams like '90s Disney direct-to-video release, but it is for Swedish audiences and a young British boy who would only months later be in Steven Spielberg's Empire of the Sun stalls aside Nick Pickard, to which this is his only credit as Mio. He does not go on to do any film after this. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the main antagonist, Kato, is played by Christopher Lee. During a bit of a slump in Lee's career, post-Wicker Man and Man with the Golden Gun, but pre-Lord of the Rings. Christopher Lee, a man who makes bad movies better and good movies great. Christopher Lee, thank you, you were sorely missed. Next up, I believe the most recent entry into this list, actually, as I watched it at the Vermont International Film Festival, and it won't be released to major theaters or streaming until January 17th, 2023. I am talking about the cerebral and exotic delve into childhood memory from Scottish director Charlotte Wells in A24, Aftersun. In Aftersun, a 11 years old, I think, Sophie reflects on the shared joy and private melancholy of a holiday she took with her father 20 years earlier. Memories real and imagined fill the gaps between mini camcorder footage as she tries to reconcile the father she knew with the man she didn't. A rapturous confessional on the state of childhood perception towards parenthood and coming of age in an uncertain world. This film asks the most universal question: these people who raised us, who are they? And the beauty behind this film is that it's not trying to answer your question, it's answering its own, and maybe it helps you ask your own. Something tells me in a few weeks all the film bros are going to have their hands on this one, and for good reason. And also because it's A24, and they're very strategic with their releases, the films they pick, and I want to say now, good movie. I think at times it's a slog. Not to say this thing shouldn't be like some action-packed, tight narrative, but the pacing is questionable at times. Paul Mescal and Frankie Corio drop pretty good performances, and the strongest aspect of the film is probably what I mentioned before. This film asks of its audience something that no other movie kind of really does this year in the way that it does, and honestly, for its unique execution and philosophies, I would totally recommend it. A24 strikes again. Next up is one of the most fun films on this list, a film that reels you in with a ridiculous title and then keeps you watching when you realize it's actually an expertly crafted and soulful creation. Beyond Venue to 2018's The Man Who Killed Hitler and Then the Bigfoot. And for those of you who are fans of, I guess, Australian prog rock, I would say that this is the King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard of movies, a film with the most ridiculous title, but with a lot of heart and meticulous assembly. The concept is solid, the performances are pretty well executed. I mean, who else but Sam Elliott, right? And it creates a fun, unique, alternate universe. Not to mention the surprisingly professional visual effects, doing a lot with very little budget-wise. And bravo on this editor, man. Zach Procero, looked up his name, coming out of the woodwork to edit this film like nobody's business. Bravo. A lot can be attributed to the producer Douglas Trumbull as well, who helped on this film. He is a legend and pioneer of special effects. Douglas Trumbull, if you don't know, did the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey in conjunction with Stanley Kubrick. He also went on to help with Blade Runner, the original, The Tree of Life, Star Trek the Motion Picture, The Andromeda Strain, and The Man Who Killed Hitler, and also The Bigfoot. This film honestly achieves a unique aesthetic, which I was not expecting going into it, and it doesn't shy away from some bizarro deadpan humor. A perfect movie? No, but a movie worth some bizarre experiencing. This film is weird for how serious everyone involved takes it, and if you can't get down with some Nonagon Infinity or some Polygon Land, you're missing out. And that's for my King Giz fans out there, if any. Which I'm assuming no, but whatever. Moving on to a classic of the horror genre from the master himself, well, at least at executive producer role, because this year I discovered 1981's Halloween 2. A deep cut? No, but this is a discovery for me, because this is, I'll say it, my favorite of all the Halloween films. Yeah, the first one doesn't work without this one. It all should have been 1 2.5 hour movie. It's visually consistent and interesting, and I almost did an entire episode on the Halloween series, and then, truly without my knowledge, Radio Rialto did a series. So I felt very comfortable abandoning the concept, because watching the new Halloween trilogy was not particularly a joy at times. So here are my more truncated thoughts on it. Halloween 2, the second installment of the Halloween series, and a direct, moment-for-moment sequel of the first, picking up literally right when the film left off, mixing old footage and new footage relatively seamlessly to make it feel like one movie. And to be honest, this kind of feels like the second half of that 2.5 hour movie I want to see. Like, I get the appeal of the first one. I can imagine what it must have been like going to a theater and seeing that, being however old someone is and having that movie come out live. I mean, that's huge, and I think it does stand alone historically if you look at that context. But at the same time, I did watch these two back to back. I really just went on to the next one, and I think the first just works a lot better when watched directly before watching Halloween 2, because it feels like they just go together so well, and literally everything that went unanswered in the first one, well, okay, it still kind of stays unanswered, but we get just enough other things to make you realize what was happening in the first. Like, we realize the connection between Michael Myers and Jamie Lee Curtis's character. We get more Donald Pleasance, which is awesome. We get speculations on Michael Myers' development and why he's doing what he's doing, and we do basically just get more of what happened that night. And it even feels like a Carpenter film in most ways. I mean, I think it looks a bit better than the first one. Honestly, I'm saying all this. I think I prefer it. I do. But what I prefer mostly is just these two films working in tandem. I can make this call right now for the sake of horror slasher film history. 1978's Halloween, it's too popular to ignore, but I would argue that in a vacuum, the original Halloween holds up way better when connected to the second one, because it feels like there's just more of a conclusion, more character resolution, and just enough questions answered where when you get to November 1st, you just feel like you can move on a bit. And also, Halloween 2 is potentially the progenitor of a film using a cheery, unrelated song in a horror film to contrast the deadly one, which has literally become like a movie cliche must for horror films at this point, or really even any film, which in recent years, it's really gotten on my nerves, and it's such a weird and understood trick at this point. It's far from fresh. I mean, you can find so many examples of these kind of needle drops in recent cinema. A gruesome, terrible thing happens, and then bam, a sonic juxtaposition, usually when the closing credits begin. It's meant to be and life goes on, how beautifully, gloriously twisted we are, taking such an innocent song and pairing it with this footage. I don't know. It's very played out. So when I see Mr. Sandman playing on the opening and closing credits of Halloween 2, I do take it with a grain of salt, being potentially the film that started it all. I'm sure it slapped in theaters back in the early 80s, but now, I don't know. I'm not so sure. I mean, the saturation of films like this in the film world today, especially just Joker, 2019's Joker does it, and just films from Blumhouse, Spectrevision, even A24 on some occasions. But overall, Halloween 2, good movie. Next up, an interesting, forgotten swamp film in the dawn of Technicolor, 1952's Lure of the Wilderness. A young girl and her father seek refuge in a Georgia swamp until they are befriended by a trapper who penetrates the swamp in search of his dog. The film is probably most intriguing for two reasons, at least for me. First, the cinematography is really engaging. The film starts off with mysterious and dangerous journeys into the swamp looking for people who go in, but never come out, and the tension created is pretty remarkable, and the way the camera glides over the water like the sturdiest canoe, it's really something to behold, and the story's fine, too. But second point I wanted to mention, our protagonist, the trapper, is played by a young Jeffrey Hunter. Mainly a TV actor, but did plenty of films as well, and his biggest claim to fame is probably being the captain in the pilot episode of a little show called Star Trek in 1964, years before the actual show would get off the ground and air in 1967. The pilot's footage was actually famously used in a later episode of Star Trek, with Hunter's character, Captain Pike, being the previous captain of the Enterprise years earlier before William Shatner's Captain Kirk took command. But he has now become horribly disfigured in the present day, and through flashbacks, the pilot episode footage, we learn what happens. And it's pretty interesting and forward-thinking for a TV show to do that. But that was always kind of the original series of Star Trek's bread and butter. Anyways, Lure of the Wilderness. Interesting as an addition of film history. I think the pacing and visuals of the film legitimately hold up, and it's kind of worth a watch. Next up, I have a question. When you think animation, what types come to mind? Hand-drawn, stop-motion, digital animation? What about rotoscoping? Because our next film is a movie that utilizes a complete rotoscoping process in post-production and directed by one of our great American directing talents, Richard Linklater. I am talking about 2001's Waking Life. I actually saw this in my meta cinema screening class this spring, the same class that inspired that episode of Deep Picks in Season 6. And this is pretty Linklater-y, a series of waking dreams strung together with intellectual and philosophical conversations observed by the protagonist, perpetually questioning what is real in this waking life. It's an absolute trip, one people hopefully have in a movie theater, because it's a great big screen film, something you can just really get lost in if you let yourself. Each scene kind of has its own little world, and Linklater is just able to patch together into something surprisingly cohesive, and effects that would not be able to be achieved in a live-action film without, like, a massive budget, are achieved pretty effectively with rotoscoping. And if you don't know what rotoscoping is, it is described as the process of creating animated sequences by tracing over live-action footage frame by frame. Though it can be time-consuming, rotoscoping allows animators to create lifelike characters who move just like people in the real world. Now, Linklater definitely took like a very sort of purposeful jankiness to his approach of rotoscoping, because his whole idea was he would shoot the film basically on like a camcorder, very low-res footage, just digital camcorder, whatever he had on him, and then animate it afterwards, but it's not a full 24 frames per second at many times, and he really leans into this sort of surrealism that aids the film beautifully when it's going into the idea of it all being a dream. Now, Linklater actually also has a trilogy of rotoscoped films at this point. Waking Life, A Scanner Darkly, which I think is 07, or '06, and then Apollo 10.5, which actually came out this year. Each film is a bit more polished than the previous as they go along, though Waking Life honestly might be my favorite narrative of any of the films. I would say A Scanner Darkly just has like the best cast, and Apollo 10.5 I think clearly had the best budget and production behind it. It looks the best, so there are pros to each of the films. You can kind of go to one or the other and get something different and admirable out of it. But yeah, Linklater for me just hit a really prolific run from '93 to 2003. I mean, Dazed and Confused, Before Sunrise, Tape, and School of Rock, and Waking Life fits right into that era. So I think it's kind of post Before Sunrise influence really helps it greatly. You can kind of feel that. But yeah, good movie. Moving on. Oh, to a film that is for fans of sci-fi and filmmakers who live in the shadow of their filmmaking parents. No, not really, but there is someone we've discussed before on this show, Sofia Coppola, daughter of Francis Ford Coppola, director of the Godfather films and Apocalypse Now. Big name, if you haven't heard of him. He is not only a progenitor to a daughter of filmmaking, but a son, because 2 weeks ago I watched Roman Coppola's 2001 sci-fi period dramedy, CQ.
Gentlemen, we're left with only one option: to use agent codenamed Dragonfly.
A film that kind of deserves a lot of unpacking, but I'll do the short version here. The film follows an editor in 1969, a film editor, unsure about his place in the film industry and is navigating the process of making a schlocky Barbarella-esque sci-fi film in Paris, CQ. The film bounces from director to director, and all the while the editor is trying to make a documentary of his own, working to create something, in quotes, real. If you walk into this film knowing the director is Coppola's son, and you just kind of get it, you know? It all makes sense, how the film is written, who the protagonist is, how the film industry is portrayed, and how some people fill that world in. It all makes sense. It's not far from early Wes Anderson in some ways, which I think is really interesting. And my God, Jason Schwartzman is in it. I mean, look at it. It's a Coppola picture. It's American Zoetrope. And though he does not steal the show, no, I in earnest give that title to stealing the show to the lead, Jeremy Davies, who maybe gives one of his most unique performances of his career. And this is not the Jeremy Davies that I kind of have grown to know from films like Twister or The Black Phone or even his character in the TV show Lost. He's truly this character and plays him with all his charm and all his flaws really well. The film is legitimately well directed and edited, and you can tell Roman had the resources to make this film right. And the greatest compliment I can give it is that for nearly 95% of the film, I never doubt it's not 1969. The atmosphere was created so perfectly, and I admire that so much. Only maybe once or twice do I feel like, oh, this is a very early 2000s movie, as it never really leans into filmmaking tropes of the time, and I really do appreciate that. And it has some good charm. This film is a nice watch and totally worth it. It's pastiche in a mostly good way. Now, next up is actually kind of a weird little addition to this list. It's a quick one. Well, a short one. Quick to watch, long to talk about. 1923's Lulu. A stop-motion animation short from Segundo de Chamon, a Spanish film director during the birth of cinema. 1923's Lulu is, in fact, his final film. But before we get there, a background. Segundo de Chamon became involved in film through his wife, actually, who was an actress in Path Films, one of the earliest film companies in France. In 1902, he became a concessionary for Path in Barcelona, distributing its products in Spanish-speaking countries and managing a factory for the coloring of Path Films. He began shooting footage of Spanish locations for the company, and then, in 1905, he actually moved to Paris where he became a trick film specialist. His talent allowed him to return to his homeland and create a studio under the Path Studio name, and spent years co-directing and directing dozens of shorts, and in 1912, moved to helping produce and direct films in Italy. After 1917, Chamon worked creating visual effects for the films of others, including Guido Brignon's Maciste in Hell, 1925, and Abel Gance's Napoleon, the 1927 epic. Towards the end of his life, Shimon collaborated with Swiss inventor Ernest Zollinger, ex-Path and ex-Atala Films, to develop a photographic two-color film process. Shimon was planning to get back into full-time film production for his own when he died suddenly of a heart attack at, well, the age of 57. And the very year that Shimon died, the Surrealists organized a soiree that would rehabilitate the artistic reputation of Georges Méliès, and to begin the long process of recovering his films. Shimon was effectively forgotten in the wake of his death. Through over time, silent film collectors began to recognize more shorts than his, but eventually he was kind of rediscovered and dubbed the Spanish Méliès in English-speaking lands, and slowly he's become remembered as a true artist of his time. People began to realize that he could actually be credited with doing the first stenciled color animation, as well as working on the 1914 film Cabiria, a film that has the first known dolly shot in film, utilizing a device built by Shimon. His final solo directorial effort was a pet project of his and his wife, 1923's Lulu, about a monkey named Lulu that comes home and uses a magic wand to make himself dinner. No sooner as he falls asleep, a hungry burglar enters his house. And that's basically the plot. The film was made by Shimon in his private studio with the help of his wife and son, outside of any studio structure, and has never had a regular distribution. It's a fun, weird little film, and it deserves some praise. And yeah, moving on, actually to the halfway point of the episode, the film that actually kind of reminded me that I should do a film discovery year-end episode like last year. And this is the 1964 Antonioni film, Red Desert. Amid the modern wastelands and toxic factories of Italy, wife and mother Giuliana desperately tries to conceal her tenuous grip on reality from those around her, especially her successful yet neglectful husband, Ugo. Ugo's old pal, Corrado, shows up in town on a business trip and is more sensitive to Giuliana's anxieties. They begin an affair, but it does little to quell Giuliana's existential fears, and her mental state rapidly deteriorates. It's a French-Italian co-production. This is a textbook example of the burgeoning alt house movement of the 1960s as swept across Mediterranean Europe, mainly France and Italy. Directors of the French New Wave and the Italian neo-realist movements later on in the 50s were all about making gorgeous, stunning, awe-inspiring visual films where nothing happened and people dealt with existential debates on love and politics and the meaning of life through deep, artful metaphor. Yeah, some of these films of the era don't really work for me, I'll say it, but, I mean, I'll be the first film bro to say Godard, Fellini, Pasolini, Bertolucci, a little overrated. Valda, on the other hand, ridiculously underappreciated, but that's just me. Look no further than 1963's Godard's Contempt to suck the narrative life out of a stunningly beautiful film. Red Desert certainly isn't as worse an offender as Contempt or others. Like one film, the name of which is escaping me, that ends with just like 10 minutes of shots of empty streets. Whatever. I will say I do love Antonioni's L'Avventura, and Red Desert has its moments too, but it really is just so dang meandering. But I would recommend it because it is easily one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen, and maybe you'll ever see. Just from a cinematographical standpoint, this has got to be one of the greats. I mean, the use of color, Monica Vitti's striking green jacket, the red walls of the sailor's shack bedroom, the fog stretching out across the bleak winter landscape, it's all just like insane. But is it particularly engaging? You be the judge. Maybe it's for you, but I do recommend it. And Monica Vitti is just insane to watch as a leading lady as well. Moving on, we are halfway through. The final 10, the top 10, these all the ones I think I wouldn't just recommend. I personally connect with them quite deeply. And I can say a lot of awesome things about the previous 10, and I have, but these 10 are the ones that kind of are just way up my alley. And to start off, we have another short film, and one that's perfect for the holidays if you're a fan of cheery holiday film content. 2016's Come Together. This is a quick one. A short film directed by Wes Anderson about passengers on a train who, due to delays, won't be able to make it home for Christmas, and their fearless conductor, Adrian Brody, who won't let them get their spirits down. It was actually sponsored by H&M for the holiday season as like a mini advertisement, but they clearly let Wes Anderson kind of do whatever he wanted. And out of the 4 short films of Anderson's that I have seen, those being like Castello Cavalcanti, Cousin Ben Troop Screening, Hotel Chevalier, and this one is by far my favorite. I also really like Adrian Brody as an actor. I just like watching him act. It's cool. And that's all I really got to say. I mean, if you want a quick dose of holiday cheer or a quick dose of Wes Anderson, look no further than 2016's Come Together. Free to watch on YouTube. Actually, any films you can watch in full for free on YouTube, I'll link below in case you want to check any of them out. Next up, a unique silent environmental documentary, 2020's Elementa, a black and white visual meditation of wilderness and the elements. Wildlife filmmaker Richard s7e returns to the triptych format for a cinematic experience like no other. That's kind of the plot, I guess the tagline of the film. And hey, what's triptych? Well, it's 3 images placed next to each other to create a fuller, longer image while still retaining the distinction of 3 different images. Originally used in classic mural art of medieval times, the tradition of triptych format has been one seen rarely but consistently in the history of cinema. The biggest example probably is actually Abel Gantz's 1927 epic, Napoleon, which I mentioned a bit earlier, but 2020's Elementa uses triptych in a really cool way, weaving images in and out of each other with truly meditative results. And the nature of photography is pretty wonderful. Without so much as a word, it captures the modern state of nature's elements and the part we as humans play in its drastic evolution. Check it out. Next up, a short film that really surprised me and features an exciting collaboration of a father and son acting duo. I believe this film and 2014's Calvary are the only times father and son have acted together in a film, and I am talking, of course, about the 2004 Martin McDonagh short, 6-Shooter, starring Brendan Gleeson and his son, Domhnall Gleeson. Basically, it's a black and bloody Irish comedy about a sad train journey where an older man, whose wife has died that morning, encounters a strange and possibly psychotic young oddball. The oddball in question, portrayed by Ruaidhrí Conroy. Now, 6-Shooter actually won the Academy Award for live-action short in 2006, and although invited to the Academy Awards, Conroy was unable to attend due to a passport infringement on arrival, resulting in his being returned home. Now, the film takes place almost completely on a train, and was actually shot on a train, a real train, and the crew could only shoot between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m., after which it had to be cleaned for the evening commute. It's a really interesting film with great tension and a strong screenplay that unweaves slowly and masterfully to reveal more and more about each character through strong, pretty riveting dialogue. Yeah, it's a short 28-minute romp through the countryside of Ireland. Plus, Brendan and Domhnall have a pretty fun scene together.
Don't sell spirits, no?
It's 11 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, did I ask you what time it was? What I thought I asked you was, do you sell spirits?
Don't you be getting ratty with me.
Yeah, well, don't you be getting ratty with me.
How was I getting ratty with you?
Your general face was ratty.
Me face?
Your general manner was ratty.
But would you like to work on a train?
Well, is it my fault that you have a shite job?
I didn't say I had a shite job. I was saying it wasn't all I thought for myself.
Are you getting me my booze? Or am I just going to stand here like?
But yeah, check it out. Next up, a forgotten masterpiece of cast. Question: have you ever wanted to see a movie with Benicio del Toro, Willem Dafoe, Sam Rockwell, Dennis Hopper, Vincent Gallo, Gary Oldman, Jeffrey Wright, Courtney Love, Christopher Walken, and David Bowie? Well, you can. That movie exists because it is our next film, 1996's Basquiat. I really couldn't believe this film was real when I discovered it, based on the cast alone, but when I actually watched, I realized what a supreme talent Jeffrey Wright has always been. I've always liked him in various projects. I mean, just look at Westworld, or French Dispatch, Ides of March, the 2022 Batman movie, but this is a truly hidden gem of his acting prowess, and from director Julian Schnabel, who did The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, a film that nearly made this list, a film I actually kind of like more than Basquiat, but I can't really just talk about every film I watched this year, so it didn't make the cut. There is so much to admire about this film, particularly this image, which I am obsessed with this image. I love it. What a great picture of all four of these great actors. And Bowie is just freaked out in the photo, playing a dejected Andy Warhol. I love it. Or just, the fact that the score is crafted by the director himself and founding Velvet Underground musician John Cale. Or the fact that the estate of John Michael Basquiat refused to allow his actual physical works to be used, so the director personally painted the reproductions which are used throughout the film. Or the fact that David Bowie is using the actual wigs worn by the real Andy Warhol. Or just the fact that Gary Oldman and Jeffrey Wright have played Commissioner Gordon in a Batman movie, and watching them together is kind of funny. I think this film is a beautiful portrait of an artist, pun intended, I guess, and Schnabel was the perfect man to tell this story. There's a sort of quiet unrest in Jeffrey Wright's portrayal of Basquiat, and it shows the famed relationship between Warhol and Basquiat in a really interesting way. This is also Jeffrey Wright's third or fourth film ever, and it's so remarkable to see him be able to do a role like this so young. Granted, he's 30 years old at the time of release. Consider the fact that he dropped his plans of law school to pursue acting later on in his 20s. And he did. He started off in off-Broadway productions before being discovered for roles like this. And to be honest, I was kind of worried that it would be another alt film that just kind of praised its home of New York City to high heaven, but the film felt really down to earth and honest at times when showing what New York City was in the late 70s and early 80s. So, yeah, super interesting film with maybe one of the greatest assembled casts of its era. Next up, one of the oldest full-length feature films on this list, 1923's Os Lobos. After serving a sentence for a crime of passion, a seafarer arrives at Serra da Cabrera, becoming an element of fascination and disaggregation in the archaic village. Not only is this film an early example of Portuguese cinema, it's a surprisingly engaging one. The full story of its creation is still a little bit unknown. The director himself, Rino Lupo, is a bit of a mystery, as he is credited having several names and bouncing from country to country. He was born Italian-Portuguese and made films around Europe in the 1910s until fleeing west, and then when the Russian Revolution struck in 1917, he changed his name to Cesar Lupo and fled to Warsaw, Poland. He began an acting academy there and directed some films until hearing of a new studio, Invicta, in Portugal, which brings us to the era where he makes Os Lobos. His other 1923 film, Mulheres da Beira, kind of saw way more commercial success, kind of allowing him to stay for a few more years and create more films until 1930, when all records of his presence at the studio stop, with no discernible reason as to where he went. The speculation persists that he moved to Brazil and changed his name again to Roberto Lupo, and a Roberto Lupo was credited in a series of Brazilian films as an actor beginning in 1938, and that Roberto Lupo died in 1945. And much of the theory, I think, holds ground. I personally couldn't find any evidence that it was ever confirmed, so the film itself, Os Lobos, is just one chapter in a nomadic director's life that sits with this really interesting air of mystery, and is overshadowed by its more successful sister film in the annals of film history. But for me, Os Lobos is just a super cool example of early Portuguese film with beautiful exterior shots and some really interesting scenes, particularly the ending. But yeah, moving on to another short film I discovered only days ago, but it does make it high on this list, 2015's Prologue, a hand-drawn period epic of a battle between ancient peoples. For the artistry and execution alone, this is placed pretty high on my discovery list, and I do appreciate that aspect, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention what could have been, since it was meant to be the first part of a planned feature film based on the play Lysistrata by Aristophanes. That would have been quite a film to see, honestly, as all the images produced are hand-drawn on pieces of paper. The director, Richard Williams, was himself a genius in the field of animation, who is probably best known for serving as animation director on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, for which he won 2 Academy Awards, and for his unfinished feature film The Thief and the Cobbler. Not to mention being the animator behind The Pink Panther. Williams described Prologue as the only thing so far in my career that I've ever really been pleased with. And in 2013, Williams told The Guardian, "All I need is some time and 5 or 6 assistants who can draw like hell." The film was intended to be grim but funny and salacious and sexy. And kind of like his version of The Thief and the Cobbler, Prologue would never be completed, but as Williams puts it, it's the doing of it that matters. Do it for the love of it. That's all there is. And sadly, we never got the full version. But if you ever read his bio, he had one hell of a life, and it's fascinating to see what we got. So, yeah, good movie, good short. Moving on to a film that was mentioned only in passing on my 3rd episode ever with Film and just this year I finally got around to watching it. Proud to say it happened before I graduated. I can count it as a film school film. And I'm talking about 1962's Carnival of Souls. Now, Carnival of Souls is kind of a famous cult classic film, and for good reason. It is part of a very select group of films that are singular directorial efforts. That meaning, Carnival of Souls is the director's first, last, and only film to ever be made. The man in question, director Herc Harvey. Now, Harvey was a director and producer of industrial and educational films based in Kansas, and while returning to Kansas after shooting a Centron film in California, Harvey developed the idea for Carnival of Souls after driving past the abandoned Saltair Pavilion in Salt Lake City. He is quoted saying, "When I got back to Lawrence, I asked my friend and coworker at Centron Films, John Clifford, who was a writer there, how he'd like to write a feature," Harvey recalled. "The last scene, I told him, had to be a whole bunch of ghouls dancing in that ballroom. The rest was up to him. He wrote it in 3 weeks." Harvey also shot Carnival of Souls in 3 weeks on location in Lawrence and Salt Lake City after taking 3 weeks off from his job at Centron in order to direct the film, and starting with only an initial production budget of $17,000. He actually raised that $17,000 cash budget by asking local businessmen if they were willing to invest $500 in his production, just kind of going around door to door. The other $13,000 of the total $30,000 budget was deferred. Harvey was actually able to secure the rental of the Saltair Pavilion that inspired the film for $50, and several other scenes, such as the scene featuring Mary in the department store, who's the protagonist, were shot guerrilla style, with Harvey paying off locals to allow the crew to quickly film. Hilligoss described the filming process as brisk, with the cast and crew working 7 days a week. The Ariflex, which was at that time more often used by cameramen filming newsreel footage, was the camera they used to shoot Carnival of Souls, and also allowed the crew to use a moving camera in other scenes without the need for gear like dollies or cranes. Harvey's assistant director is actually Reza Badi, a young Iranian immigrant who was just beginning his film work in the States, and at this time, he had been a second unit director on one other film, Robert Altman's directing debut, The Delinquents. But Reza would go on to make, amongst other notable works, some of the best-known iconic television series openings and montages, including Hawaii Five-0, Get Smart, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Now, the U.S. release of Carnival of Souls failed to include a copyright in the prints, automatically placing them in the public domain, meaning TV networks around the country could cut the film to the desired time slot and place it in their late-night lineup constantly, in a similar way that It's a Wonderful Life began to gain traction and notoriety after its release. And it is indeed a fascinating film. If the backstory isn't enough, the plotline reads as follows. Mary Henry ends up the sole survivor of a fatal car accident through mysterious circumstances. Trying to put the incident behind her, she moves to Utah and takes a job as a church organist. But her fresh start is interrupted by visions of a fiendish man, and as the visions begin to occur more frequently, Mary finds herself drawn to the deserted carnival on the outskirts of town. The strangely alluring carnival may hold the secret to her tragic past. Dun dun dun. It's a great movie for Halloween, or really any time of the year. I think I got to see it in April. I think it was April. Anyways, check it out. Next up is our number 3 film. We're almost at the end. Number 3. Another short film, actually. A musical stop-motion film from 2017 called The Burden. A bizarre, otherworldly meditation on relationships and the meaning of existence. It's the third film from Swedish director Nikki Lindroth von Bahr, and her follow-up to this would actually be a Netflix film in conjunction with 2 other animators, 2022's The House, kind of an anthology film, of which she is credited to the second portion. Sadly, kind of my least favorite of the three, personally, but I consider her masterpiece to be The Burden, since I promise you, you ain't seen nothing like this film. And it's unlike any stop-motion narrative I've seen before, not to mention the classic trope, it's a musical. And when I say musical, get ready for something entirely different from the musicals you know. Lindroth describes the film as liberation through great catastrophe. And I don't know, I find that very fascinating, considering the tone of the songs, the overall atmosphere that the film produces. I would argue it is very fun, but at the same time, one of the saddest films I've seen all year. And if you start watching it and don't get what I mean, just wait until the ending, and it all kind of drifts into place. But yeah, I would recommend. Next up, on number 2, a majestic film adaptation of a classic Virginia Woolf novel. Yes, we're talking about 1992's Orlando. England, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I promises Orlando, a young nobleman obsessed with poetry, that she will grant him land and fortune if he agrees to satisfy a very particular request.
There can be no doubt about his sex, despite the feminine appearance that every young man of the time aspires to.
Do not fade, Orlando. Do not grow old.
Yes, this film, directed by Sally Potter, probably her best-known work, stars a young, vigorous Tilda Swinton as the titular Prince Orlando and his journey through life in Elizabethan England and beyond. There's kind of little I can say without spoiling the content of the film and its bonkers nature, but it is often regarded as one of Swinton's best and one of the most unique film adaptations to date. Beautifully shot, masterfully edited, well written, and directed out the wazoo. It is a creative dream realized, and it's just this fascinating blend of class and rebellion. I mean, Tilda Swinton also playing the male lead works wonders for the aesthetic of the film, and she's able to bring, I guess, a je ne sais quoi to the role, this softness yet yearning to become something greater. And then obviously there's Queen Elizabeth II, portrayed herself by a man, Quentin Crisp, which is much harder to point out underneath all the makeup. But Potter saw Swinton actually in a Manfred Colgate play, Man to Man, and said there was a profound subtlety about the way she took on male body language and handled maleness and femaleness. And in Potter's words, Quentin Crisp was the queen of queens, particularly in the context of Virginia Woolf's gender-bending politics, and thus was fit to play the aged Queen Elizabeth. The New York Times said of the film that this ravaging and witty spectacle invades the mind through eyes that are dazzled without ever being anesthetized. Throughout Miss Potter's Orlando, there is a piercing kind of common sense and a joy that, because they are so rare these days in any medium, create their own kind of cinematic suspense and delightfully surprised laughter. Orlando could well become a classic of a very special kind, not mainstream perhaps, but a model for independent filmmakers who follow their own irrational muses. It has in recent years been lauded also as a landmark in queer cinema, particularly when it was included in a multi-level arts project called Orlando, The Queer Element. The event also served part of the National Trust's Prejudice and Pride program, which marked 50 years since the partial decriminalization of homosexuality in the UK with the passage of the Sexual Offences Act in 1967. So, with modern gender politics as they are, I think the film really breathes anew and can be looked upon as a forward-thinking and brash depiction of a classic novel tackling concepts of the meshing of manhood and womanhood throughout history. It's a pretty artsy film, with Tilda Swinton's fourth wall breaks and these sweeping, sometimes meandering atmosphere scenes from era to era of Orlando's life. But overall, it's just a gorgeous watch, and can't recommend it enough to anyone looking for some prime Tilda content. I remember finishing the movie and asking myself, how did Tilda Swinton feel comfortable continuing her career after a performance like that? Because, I mean, how do you expect to get any better? Did she feel like she'd peaked? Because I feel like she peaked here, but no, we still had 2018 Suspiria on the way, and thank goodness, what great movies we get to watch. But yeah, I loved Orlando. Please check it out if you ever get the chance. But yeah, if you're counting at home, this leads us to our final film, number 1, final movie of the episode. And I asked myself whether this next film should be first or if Orlando should have been first, because to be honest, the two above, they're kind of pretty interchangeable, just as like numbers 3 through 7 are kind of interchangeable. But I think I went with this one because I wanted to end on a zany, optimistic note, to leave off with a film that left me just feeling warm and happy inside. And at the number 1 spot on my 2022 film discovery list it's none other than 1965's Timepiece, directed by a young Jim Henson. Timepiece is like an experimental jazz comedy short. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's a series of rolling visual gags and observational ideas starring the Muppet Man himself, Jim Henson. And yet it's notable since this is one of the few films produced by Henson that includes no puppets. It feels like a film inspired by free association creative techniques from one of the best to ever do it. The film has very little dialogue, except every once in a while Jim Henson says a word or two in a voice very close to his Kermit voice we would all get to know very well in the coming years. This is just about 9 minutes of raw, unadulterated creativity, using animation, practical visual effects, a lot of surrealist yet grounded imagery, and all mostly to the beat of a clock or a metronome or jazz instrumentation. It's just plain fun. And if you're talking wacky experimental film in the 60s, this is the apex. I mean, this is the great example of the Technicolor 60s short film explosion that we saw as film kind of slowly gained popularity at an amateur level with an avant-garde bend, through film school in the 60s. And this was also nominated for Best Short Film at the Oscars that year, which, cool. Very similar to the Story of Frank film, which made my discovery list last year. And it was also distributed initially by Path Contemporary Films, the same company that Segundo de Chamon joined forces with 50 years prior. I mean, overall, this was a beautiful, uplifting film to watch, and I cannot recommend it enough. I mean, what a way to end this list, but with a little bit of pure optimism. And that's it, my film discovery list for 2022. What a year of watching movies. Next time that I might be wrapping up the year in a way like this will probably be the Andy's nomination episode, which will be out quite soon, only a few weeks away, maybe like mid-February-ish. We'll see, but until then, you can always go back to our previous episodes of the Andes and our Andes playlist, and anything from our back catalog in the first 6 seasons of Film and Film Asterisk. And you can always check out our Letterboxd lists for the show at Cranberry18, CRANDberry18, and DA_N. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming onto this channel in the year 2022. It has been a joy. And yeah, have a good rest of your year. You'll be hearing from me in 2023. See ya.